So thank you everyone for joining us for day two of our Which Grass is Which webinar series. Today we're going to be focusing on prairie grass identification. If you're just joining us, feel free to put where you're joining us from in the chat box. We're going to be using the chat today for some quizzes that we'll have throughout, and then any questions, feel free to put those in there. Abigail is on moderating for me today, and she'll be in there looking at your questions, and then any technical issues, you can direct those to her, and she'll get back to you to help with that if there are any. We're going to get started today with just a little bit of a review of what we talked about yesterday. So in day one, we did spend a good chunk of time reviewing kind of the basics of grass ID terminology in general. And I know not everyone was able to make it, or this is also a lot of information. So we're going to start today kind of reviewing some of that basic information so we're all on the same page when it comes to a lot of the terms that we're going to be using when it comes to grass identification. And then we'll move into looking at prairie grasses today. So we're going to cover about 17 different species. Just a note on the handouts, I have had some updates to those. So I did post a new version today. Nothing major has changed if you already have it printed out, but just know I did do an update. If you already downloaded tomorrow's, that one did have some changes. I had some internet issues with saving it, and so I thought it was done and it wasn't last week when I posted it. So Abigail put that in the chat, but just know that one you might want to re-download and compare if you're preparing for tomorrow. But let's go ahead and get into today's program. So just as a refresher, my name is Erin Garrett. I'm a natural resource, environment, and energy educator in Southernmost Illinois for Illinois Extension. I've been identifying grasses for quite a long time, and I got my start out in the field doing field identification, working at various different internships, and then at my graduate school research project. So what I've developed is more of a field, simpler approach to grass identification. So we know grasses are difficult to identify. Plants in general are difficult to identify. And a lot of the resources out there and help when it comes to grass ID is focused on kind of really complex terminology, maybe using a microscope to see really small features. And we might have to use a hand lens to see some of them, depending on how well our eyesight is. But we're going to try to keep it as approachable and simple as possible, not really using a lot of technical measurements either for things. So a little bit more general grass identification characteristics. So that's what we're going to do today. And like I said, we're going to just get started right away and look at a review of the terms that we talk about. So we're not going to get into all the terms, but we do have some that we're going to use. So it's important that we're all on the same page with what we're talking about with those. So if you were here yesterday, you remember this diagram. I put all our labels here so we can run through these quickly. But kind of the backbone of the grass is going to be a stem. You may also see the term comb. I usually don't use that one, but in an ID book, you might run across that same thing as a stem. What we typically think of as a leaf has three different components, okay? A blade, a sheath, and a node. The leaf blade is the structure that we typically think of when we think of a leaf, but that blade is going to wrap around the stem and form a structure called the sheath. Okay, where that sheath ends, there's going to be a swelling called a node or a joint, and that's at the bottom of the leaf sheath. So then below, we can see here again a little bit of stem. We've got our leaf blade coming in down into a sheath, and then that swelling is a node. The presence of nodes can help differentiate between like grasses versus sedges and rushes. Again, we focused on that yesterday. We're not going to get into that again today, but those are the three parts of our leaves. This area right here where that leaf blade transitions into the sheath, we call that the collar region, and there's a few different identification characteristics within that region that we're going to look at and that are really useful for identification, things like ligules, auricles, and horns. Okay, and then the top part of the grass, that flowering part of the grass, is going to be called the inflorescence, and we'll look at that in more detail as well. Okay, so in that collar region where our leaf blade becomes the sheath, if we pull that leaf blade back like I did in this photo here, we're going to be looking for a structure right here called a ligule. Okay, a ligule, if it's there, which it usually is, not in this photo, but typically we're going to find a membrane or some sort of collection of hairs. The size of that membrane, the type of hairs, those are all going to be important differentiation characteristics. Also, if you find a grass without a ligule, that's an important characteristic too. So this is what it looks like when there's no ligule present. And here are three examples of what it looks like when you do have a ligule present. So on the left, this is a hairy ligule here. These are, I would describe them as velvety hairs. If we were able to be in person, you would feel that texture on there, but sometimes they can be bristly, they can be short, tall, different options. Membranes are going to be on the right, and they can be, I usually classify them as short or tall. Again, keeping it really simple. Hopefully you can tell a height difference here between the two pictures. And membranes typically early in the season are going to be kind of white in color. But as we get later into the season, they can turn yellow, orange, or brown, and then even fade away. Just like the hairs, they can kind of wither away over time too. So ligules, great identification characteristic early in the season when the grasses are young. If we get into like late fall or if you're doing winter botanical work, some of those characteristics might not be there anymore, so just keep that in mind. Okay, two other terms I talked about are auricles and horns. Auricles are going to be extra leafy material that looks like arms at the base of that leaf sheath. I don't think any of the grasses in the prairie section are going to have auricles. Things like oh no, we are going to talk about one rye today. So the ryes will have auricles. So that's an easy clue that really helps narrow down the grass you're looking at. And then we will look at Indian grass today, which has horns. It's the only grass that I've seen that has horns. Doesn't mean there aren't others out there, but thus far in Illinois, that's the only one I found with horns. And it's this kind of stiff upper um, leaf material that comes up from the leaf sheath. Rather than out like an arm, it kind of points upward. You can see here there's two different versions that I've seen on Indian grass. You got some really short horns and some taller ones. Okay, moving on into kind of the flowering portion of the grass. That whole top piece, when it's in bloom, is called the inflorescence, just like in any other flowering plant. That's the term that we use for that group of flowers. A few terms for our grasses is the stem that we talked about turns into the rachis. So a rachis is just a stem of the inflorescence. A lot of the times I still refer to it as just the stem because that's easier, but technically it is called a rachis. If we have little stalks along that, they can be called pedicels. Again, I often refer to them as stalks, or we have branches as well. And then the spikelet is the term that you'll hear a lot. That is the flowering unit of a grass. So that's going to contain all of the reproductive parts. That's where your seed is going to develop. And we're going to keep it pretty basic. We're going to talk about spikelets as a whole. If you are versed in grass ID terms, you might hear other parts and pieces of those. We're not going to focus on that at all. Again, trying to keep it with more of the field-based approach. Okay, there are a couple structures that we can find around our our spikelets, that we're going to look at real quick. So the first one is bristles, and the second one is awns. Okay, bristles are going to be exactly what they sound like, a bristle-like structure, but it emerges from the base of a spikelet. And they're usually found in multiples, so like in a foxtail. So in my little drawing here, this is the top of the spikelet, this is the base where it would be attached into our inflorescence, and we've got, what, 8 different bristles attached here. So in a foxtail, again, if we were in person, I'd have you pluck a few spikelets off and you'd find a little nest of bristles that comes with it that's at the base. You might also see and are more likely to see something called awns. Okay, so these are like bristles, but they emerge from the tip of the spikelet rather than the base. Okay, they can vary a lot in size, shape, color, arrangement, and a lot of the times they're there to prevent herbivory, but they also can have other helpful uses. So in the picture on the left, this is Indian grass. We have some short-ish awns on this one, whereas in a bottle brush grass, they're going to be a bit longer and they're paired. And then in a porcupine grass over here that we'll look at again today, they can be, over 5 inches long. So awns are definitely something we're going to look at if your grass is flowering. Okay, let's take our first quiz. So if you would like to put in the chat each part of the grass here, A, B, C, D, and E. E is referring to the whole spot that has the circle around it. A is referring to this part right here. I wanted you to be able to see it. So A is right here. E is this whole section. Go ahead and drop those answers in the chat and we'll see how we do. I'm seeing some answers coming in. It's good. I tried to be a little tricky with some of them, but y'all are so good. It's not working. Give us another 30 seconds to get those answers in. All right, thanks everyone. Let's go through these. The first one, A, is going to be a node. Okay, a node right here. So the base of that leaf sheath, which means that B is a sheath. I was kind of tricky with you on that one. It looks like a stem, but it's covered by that leaf sheath. Because our node is here, that means that C is going to be a stem. Okay, we've got a stem here. D is a leaf blade or just a leaf. And then E is going to be that collar region where you can find things like a ligule. Excellent job. All right, next we're going to just review the three main types of inflorescences or the way that those spikelets can be arranged. And we're going to break it down into some paired statements. So our first paired statement is going to be, does our rachis, remember that's the stem of our inflorescence, is it branched or is it unbranched? If it's branched, we call that a panicle. Okay, here's a couple different examples of panicles. They can vary and look different. It's not all going to be the same. Kind of the typical arrangement is this like open, airy, branched arrangement of spikelets. But sometimes, they all dangle off to one side. You have branches that just have one spikelet on them. So a couple different ways that that can look. And we'll see tons of examples as we go today. On the other end, if our rachis is unbranched, we're going to ask another question. We're going to ask if our spikelets are held on pedicels or little stalks, or if they're directly attached to that rachis, that main stem of the inflorescence. If we go over here and we have no branches and no pedicels, we call that a spike. So that one's pretty intuitive and easy to remember. Most of the times they look spike-like. So everything's just directly attached along that rachis. The raceme is going to be kind of the catch-all category. If it's not a panicle and it's not a spike, then we categorize it as a raceme. Racemes are tricky, and sometimes it doesn't look like it fits in that category, but it does. So kind of the traditional way that we'd see a raceme is where we have all of our spikelets held on pedicels or little stalks. Now you might say, what's the difference between a pedicel and a branch? Great question. It's hard to differentiate between those two. And it just kind of comes down to honestly like the length and the size of it. If it's really short, we would call it more a raceme. If it's longer, we'd be like, well, that's a branch. It's probably a panicle. Another collection of spikelets that we see on the raceme side is this long finger-like collection of spikelets that then is attached with a little pedicel all together as one piece. So things like a crabgrass, a big bluestem, are going to have these finger-like collections of spikelets. So that's, again, it fits a little bit differently than some of the others. So just to recap and review, and so you have this in the handout, we've got branches, spikelets that can be on little pedicels or not, but they're at least on a branch in our panicle. We've got no branches or pedicels on a spike, and then a little bit of a mix on the raceme here. And yes, blue grama is an example of a raceme. Very good. We'll look at that one today too. Okay, so a few quizzes for you. These are different grasses than we looked at yesterday in our quiz. So we'll start with this grass. Go ahead and put in the chat what you think this one is, a panicle, a raceme, or a spike. And as you're thinking about that one, I did mention it yesterday. Not everyone agrees. So sometimes folks that are describing grasses will say, it's a spike-like raceme. So you're like, it basically looks like a spike, but technically it's a raceme, or it's a raceme-like panicle. So some of them can, there's wiggle room with that one. So this one, we're gonna call it a raceme because we have these long finger-like connections. You might be like, well, Erin, I don't see the little pedestal right here that attaches it. And you'd be right, it's very, very small or barely there. So in some cases, you might say that this looks more like a panicle with a branch and everything attached to it. So I'm gonna go raceme, but again, it's not completely clear and not everyone agrees. So if that gives you a little comfort, just know jury is out on some of these. Okay, here's our next one. This is going to be just an oat. What does this one look like? It's not the best picture, but make your guess. I'm giving you a taste of sometimes the pictures that I get, and I'm like, ooh, I don't know. I can't really tell that great. We're going to do our best with a webinar, right? I would love to have all of you together in person, but okay, most folks are getting it. This one we would classify as a panicle. We see all these little branches with our spikelets then attached to them. Okay, here's number 3. Y'all are getting the hang of it now. It's also the third one, so we haven't talked about it yet. This one is a spike, very good. All of our little spikelets attached to that rachis. And then I did put in a fourth one that we can make our guesses. Okay, again, most of you are getting it. This one is big bluestem, and we would call this one a raceme. So again, finger-like collections of spikelets attached with little stalks. It's hard to kind of point those out on this photo. Again, we do our best with the pictures rather than in person. So we call this one a raceme. Oh, surprise, there's a fifth one. I forgot. I put in a fifth one. Last one, go ahead, make your guess. This is a Johnson grass, an invasive that we'll look at tomorrow. And again, really good. We're getting it. This one is a panicle, kind of that more open airy, really branched, heavily covered in spikelets version of a panicle. So great job, everyone. Um, excellent, excellent job. All right, I'm going to pause right here and see if we have any questions about just our grass ID terms, grass ID in general, before we get into our prairie grasses.
Yeah, you had a couple in the chat that I just want to make sure I address. If anybody else has any others they want to put in while we're answering these. I'll work backwards here. We had a recent one when it came to that recent quiz you had. Does opposite or alternate matter in regards to like the stalks?
That's a good question. I have never looked at that at all with grass identification. I know with a lot of our other plants, like looking at leaf arrangement and things like that, opposite and alternate comes into play. Not really with grasses.
And then back when you were talking about terminology, when it came to like oracles and horns, are there varieties without oracles or horns, or is it typically one or the other?
Oh, that's a good question. So horns is very specific, right? That only that one grass that I've seen that on. Oracles are typically only on a few groups of grasses, a few genera of grasses. And so most of the time you're not going to see oracles or horns. Most of the time you're going to see some sort of ligule. And you can also find a ligule with the horns and with the oracles. So they're not all like either or. You can definitely find combos. Whoop.
Got it. So the oracles and horns are very helpful in identification
Mhm.
because if it is there, you can hone it in much quicker.
Exactly.
Nice. Is horns a technical term like oracle, ligule, etc.?
Yes.
There you go. All right, and then we had a couple more in the chat. Somebody was saying, can you repeat that phrase defining a raceme, the finger-like projections of dot 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 dot?
Yeah, so I would call it a finger-like collection of spikelets. So you're going to have that dense, I don't know, a dense, like branch basically of spikelets that then is attached with a little stalk.
And then are the nodes always below sheaths or is sometimes just here and there on the stem?
Oh, that's a good question. So a node is always going to be um, where that leaf sheath ends, is where you're going to have that node. Mhm.
And then last thing is somebody was asking about is there anything specific we're looking for when it comes to like winter ID, things that like maybe wouldn't be there that we would see like wouldn't be there that we would have seen like in the summer or spring?
So there's going to be nothing new. A lot of the times you are dealing with fewer characteristics, fewer like hairs. If there's like hairs on the leaves or the stems, they might be gone too, just with like weathering over time. Some of the grasses are going to have a distinctive color in the fall and the winter, and we'll point that out as we go today. And then you're going to be looking, you're going to have that seed head, which is oftentimes when you're early in grass identification, it's not flowering yet, and you just have leaves, and it's really, really hard to tell them apart. So honestly, sometimes like winter ID is even easier than spring ID because you'll likely have a flowering structure to look at. It might just look a little different. When I have them, I do have like a late fall picture of these grasses included. So we hopefully you'll see that as we go through today.
Awesome. That's all we got.
Mhm. All right. Well, thanks everyone. We'll go ahead and move into the main bulk of today, which is going to be looking at our prairie grasses. So most of the ones we're going to focus on today, again, we're focused on Illinois, is going to be those that are found in the tall grass prairie, right? So if you're not familiar, there are kind of three main prairie types. There's a lot of nuance there and other categories of grassland-like systems in the US, but we have the short grass, the mixed, and the tall grass prairie. We're going to be focusing mostly on the tall grass, not saying that these aren't present in the others as well. Of course, if we're thinking prairie, the grasses we're going to look at today are adapted to growing in full sun. This doesn't mean that some of them can't grow in part shade, but you're not likely to find these if you go into the woods, right? Most of the ones we're going to look at today, but not all, are warm season grasses. If you joined us yesterday, a lot of our woodland species were cool season grasses. So cool season are going to put on most of their growth and grow in the early spring. Warm season are going to put on most of their growth and um, grow in the summer and then flower right about now, end of July, into the late summer, early fall. Again, this depends on where you are in the state, where you are across the country. So lots of variation there. Most of these prairie grasses are going to have deep roots because they're adapted to that disturbance. They're adapted to fire and grazing, so they put on a huge amount of biomass underground, and we may only see a limited amount of that above the ground. And then, like I said earlier, we're going to go through 17 plants today. So I know it's a lot. I do have some quizzes put in here and a few lookalikes. So we'll try to keep a good pace with these. But we're going to go ahead and get started with a fun quiz. If you know what the state grass of Illinois is, I put some different options for you up here just as a fun start to kick us off today. Can't fool any of you. You're all pros. We've got lots of guesses for C, big bluestem, which I realize if you printed out the handouts, you would guess that based on my second question, which is what other state recognizes big bluestem as their state grass? We'll see if we have any folks joining from outside Illinois that know this answer. This is our fun trivia today. We got some guesses in here. Go ahead, I'll take a couple more. Okay, to my knowledge, Missouri is the only other state that recognizes Big Blue as their state grass. So not every state has a state grass, but those that do and that chose Big Blue is Illinois and Missouri. So that's where we're going to kick things off today is looking at Andropogon gerardii, our big blue. So this grass, as we can see on our range map, can be found in every county in the state. Makes sense when we consider that most of Illinois, of course not all, we have a lot of forested areas as well, but a lot of the state was tallgrass prairie. So you can find big blue in prairies as well as in more savannas and in some glade ecosystems too. In general, this one's going to stay under 8 feet tall. So it is going to be what I call like a robust grass. It's one of kind of three dominant species that we find across the tallgrass prairie. It is a warm season grass and it is a bunch grass, although sometimes, like in the picture on the left, it grows so densely that you can't tell that it's a bunch grass. So it is definitely aggressive and it does spread as well. So bunch grass, but oftentimes doesn't look it. If we're looking up close for some characteristics on our leaves, you can find some kind of sparse hairs along the sheath and at the base of the leaf blade, but that's going to be separate from a ligule. We are going to have a short membranous ligule on our big blue stem as well. Something that's a reliable characteristic for me with this grass is that the stems are kind of flattened. So whereas most of our grass stems are pretty round, if you rolled it between your fingers, it would roll very easily. Big Blue is it's gonna be a little bit more challenging to roll it because it's a bit flattened. So I typically, if I'm thinking it's Big Blue, I'll just grab a stem and do that test. That helps me out. And a lot of the times they're going to see different colors too. So you might see more of a yellow or a reddish stem. Unfortunately, it's usually not blue, like the name suggests. A lot of times botanists named red things blue. Um, I don't know why, that's just how it is. And then, of course, most of us are familiar with this kind of iconic flowering shape, kind of called it a turkey foot shape, raceme inflorescence. Okay, so a few close-up pictures of the stems. Um, so we can see here kind of that reddish to yellow color on the stem right here. Hopefully you see some of these hairs at the base of the leaf as well. And this picture over here, we can see it's really red, right? Red and yellow. Even the base of the leaf sheaths have that orangey tinge. And then over here, we're going to have, again, more of a reddish orange stem. Okay. In our photo over here, I kind of pulled that leaf blade back a little bit. There's a little bit of an orange membrane right here, membranous ligule. And then again, those kind of sparse hairs. I didn't have a close-up, I didn't put a close-up picture of the leaves, but the leaves can also have color to them. So they can have a little bluish purple red color on the tips of the leaves when it's young. But some of our other prairie grasses can have that too. So again, not really a reliable, this is big blue stem characteristic. Here we can see it in bloom. You can see kind of the bunch growth form. This is kind of one of our um, racemes that hasn't fully popped open yet. So it doesn't have that full shape. But this one is in full bloom. So we can see kind of these yellow and orange structures. Those are the anthers or the male parts. And then we have our stigmas, which are kind of fluffy and whitish red. Big Blue does have awns. I didn't mention that. There are some awns on the spikelets. Oftentimes we don't need to get to that level, right, to tell that it's Big Blue. There's a lot of other clues that we have that are filling in that answer for us. And then this is going to be kind of our late fall view. Once it's gone to seed, you can see sometimes you get a little bit more of these white fluff there. And those parts of those spikelets are kind of held a lot more open. So that's what you would see kind of fall into winter. Okay, and all of this is we have the male and female parts together on our flowers. Okay, so I usually refer to it as big blue stem or big blue, but there are other names that folks know it by. If you want to share any of those names in the chat, you can do that as well. Common names are crazy. There's a lot of different ones out there for a lot of different plants. And I'm always interested what people use for some of these. So I see turkey foot. Excellent. Any others? All right. Excellent. Okay, we're going to move on to our next grass, which is broomsedge. We are going to talk about little blue, but I am going to put broomsedge in there first because it's in the same genus Andropogon as big blue stem. So more closely related to big blue stem than little is to big. And broom sedge is not a sedge, it's a grass. Again, I didn't choose these common names. I don't know who did, but sometimes it's a little bit more confusing than helpful. So broom sedge is a grass. It is native also. I think a lot of folks have the perception that broom sedge is non-native. It is a little bit more on the weedier side and in where it grows typically. So you'll find it in prairies, but you'll also kind of find it more in pastures, other disturbed areas along roadsides. So typically in those habitats. This one is another warm season grass, another bunch grass, but it's a lot shorter than big blue stem. So typically between 3 and 4 feet tall. And I typically describe this one as pretty bushy looking. And that's going to be important when we are starting to differentiate it from little blue stem, which is its look-alike plant. Kind of bushier, a lot leafier. These are not technical terms, but helpful in telling them apart. When we look in that collar region and at the base of the leaf, we're going to find a lot of hairs. These have racemes of fluffy, feathery spikelets that you can kind of see a few of right here. This is not going to be a finger-like collection raceme. It's going to be a raceme where it's a little spikelet attached with a little stalk. Okay. Just like big blue stem, broomsedge has flattened stems and a short membranous ligule. And then hopefully you can see in the photo in the fall and through the winter, the foliage is going to turn that golden orange color, which is kind of one of the most reliable ways to identify it. Way easier in the fall and winter than in the summer. Distribution wise, you can see it is pretty widespread, but pretty absent in most of northern Illinois. Okay, here are some close up photos. And we can start to see those hairs that you can find on the edge of the leaf blades along the sheath here. Okay, here is our short membranous ligule, kind of orangey in color on this one. You can't really tell, but flattened stem. We don't really have that color differentiation as much. I think this is just the lighting of how I took this photo. It's not really yellow. It is much more green. And then this is kind of in the early stage of blooming. But rather than looking at focusing on that characteristic, I just want you to look at how leafy it is. There's a lot of leaves up these stems, right? It's pretty bushy. Okay, and then here we go. When we start to flower, we are going to have these spikelets that are attached with a little stalk. As it matures, it's going to get these little floofs on them of this kind of like eyelash looking white fluff. And then you're going to see all of that remaining here once it kind of senesces or that vegetation starts to die back and it isn't actively growing anymore. Okay, so with this, again, we're going to get that color differentiation here where everything is going to turn that orangey red, pretty much all the different parts of that grass as we get into the fall. So keep that in mind. We're going to move to little bluestem now. Now, little blue is in a different genus, Schizacrium, than the broomsedge and the big blue, and can be confused very easily with broomsedge. If you're in some of the northern counties in Illinois, though, you're likely going to find little blue, right? Distribution maps aren't 100% accurate, but they're really helpful clues with that. So little blue is going to be a lot more indicative of like a higher quality habitat. You're not really going to find it as much in disturbed areas or in pasture settings, right? We're going to find it more on bluffs or glades or savannas or in our remnant prairies. That's going to be more of the habitat for this grass. It is a little bit shorter in general than our broom sedge, so typically under 3 feet tall, another warm season bunch grass. If you're reading through these characteristics, a lot of them are going to be the same as in the broom sedge. So we're going to get that great color in the fall, orangey red. We're going to have flattened stems again. We're going to have a short membranous ligule. In this case, we're going to have thinner leaves, thinner stems. I like to say little bluestem's a little bit more delicate of a grass, whereas our broom sedge is really bushy. And again, it's hard when they're not side by side to kind of see that differentiation. Here we're going to have more of these collections of spikelets attached to a stalk, but sometimes just individual spikelets can also be attached. So it can kind of go either way. You can see a little bit of this reddish stem as well. Okay, so a few different pictures. This is another grass that early in the season, like Big Blue, you're going to find some stronger colors potentially on some of your leaf sheaths or at the base of your stems. So here we do have kind of a bluish purple red color going on, but it can also just be green. I did put in here some little blue can be bluer, whereas some tends to be more red. And these aren't these are just naturally occurring varieties, not really characteristics that have been chosen and bred for, at least in the pictures I'm showing you. But there is definitely natural variation in that. So this source of these plants in my garden, it was the like truer blue. Whereas over here, when I was out in a restoration site, found this really, really strong red color. So it can vary along that color gradient too. Okay, here are a few pictures of it in bloom. Its spikelets are going to be smaller than the broom sedge, a lot more delicate. Again, hard when they're not side by side. You can see that there are some awns along the spikelets. Broom sedge can have them too. So again, hard to differentiate, but just kind of getting honestly, I look at the leafiness, how delicate the stems are is a lot of what I use to tell them apart. Okay, so based on this, just in general, I put them both up here. You can make your guess which is which. And if there's anything else that you use to tell them apart that you want to share between Broomsedge and Little Blue. Okay, I'm seeing some guesses in here. We do have the left is Broomsedge and the right is Little Bluestem. So folks are saying habitat is one clue, definitely. Um, oh, Broomsedge being more like vertical versus like kind of vase shaped in the Little Blue. I like that. Looking at the whole form, excellent. Looking at soil, I have kind of heard of that too. Is that like broom sedge is more indicative of poor soil? I don't know how accurate that is or not, but like just again, looking in like the quality of the habitat that you find them, you do find broom sedge in more of those disturbed areas that don't have higher quality soil. And the little blue does like more of the prairies, the glades, things like that. Okay, excellent. Great job, everyone. Okay, we're going to move into our next one, which is Indian grass. This is kind of the second kind of quintessential tall grass prairie species that we find, along with Big Blue. So Sorghastrum nutans. This one is, it's the only grass in its genus in Illinois. So nothing that looks super, super similar to it. You're going to find this same places as Big Blue, prairies, savannas, glades, same height, same kind of general growth pattern. So warm season bunch grass. It is another one that can spread pretty aggressively and fill in an area. So might not look like a bunch grass, but if you're there and you can see it in person, you'll see individual clumps of it. This grass, it's hard to photograph and you can't really tell in these two pictures, but I find that the stems and the leaves tend to have like an overall bluish hue. And especially before it's blooming, if you find a big clump of it, it just kind of stands out from the rest of the like typical greens that you see. So that's one clue that I use is kind of that bluish color. Our leaves are going to have a prominent white midrib that we'll look at. The nodes can tend to be a little bit more velvety. But the most reliable characteristic I look for, right? Again, this is a big grass, a big bunch grass. So size, if I see that, I'm going to look for the horns. That's kind of the easiest check, and then I would know it's Indian grass. You'll also find a membranous ligule there. And then when it flowers, really distinctive too. It has a panicle inflorescence. It's this beautiful golden orange color. They're covered in these soft velvety hairs. They have awns. If you catch it when it is blooming, you'll see yellow anthers that are kind of sprinkled throughout it. So really, really stunning grass. And then, of course, it is found in every county in Illinois. So likely that you'll see it. I even see this like this and Big Blue you can see along the roadsides, like driving down the interstate, which is always a nice change when you see this and not something invasive growing, right? So I'm including these two different pictures of horns. Um, I don't know why they're so different or variable. I'm just showing you the different versions that I've seen. This one I took this picture up in northern Illinois, and this one I took down in southern Illinois. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but just know they can vary in height. I also, before it blooms, over on this right picture, it has, I don't know how to describe it, but it looks very spiky to me. Like the leaves and like the inflorescences are developing in here, the panicles, and they haven't popped open yet. But it gets this very like sharp pointed look to it. And then combine that with kind of the blue hue, and you can kind of see that stand out. Okay. Once those panicles start to pop out, they're going to be contracted and really holding those spikelets close to the stem. And then they'll kind of pop open as they continue to bloom, as we see in that middle photo. Again, you can see that color. And then on the right, we can see some of those yellow anthers. We can see the awns. We can see the velvety hairs. So a lot of really distinctive characteristics, especially when it does start to flower. Okay, next is switchgrass. This is going to be the third of our dominant tallgrass prairie species. This one, even though it's considered one of the three top ones, is definitely a little bit more restrictive than big blue and Indian grass. We see those typically forming really big kind of colonies, whereas switchgrass tends to be a little bit more restrictive. I'm not quite sure why that is. But we're going to find it again, same habitat, tall, robust, warm season bunchgrass. It does stay a little bit shorter than the other two. One of the most reliable characteristics that I use, especially early in the growing season, is to look for a triangle-shaped collection of hairs at the base of the leaf blade. This is not going to be a ligule. It's going to be just a dense white fluff that's in a triangle shape of hairs. We'll look at pictures of those in a second. Another thing that I look for late in the growing season, like when we get into fall, is that the leaves curl very tightly, more like corkscrew shaped, once they start to die back. So again, that combined with the size of this grass and where it's growing. So in your prairie restorations, in your remnants, big, robust grass that's got tightly curled leaves, likely to be switchgrass. And then it does have a panicle with reddish spikelets on it. Big open airy panicle. We're talking like over a foot in size of that structure. And one of the lookalike grasses for switchgrass is Johnson grass, which is regulated and is an invasive. So it's important to be able to tell them apart. We did show a picture of Johnson grass earlier today as an example of a panicle. And one of the things about it is it just has so many more spikelets on it. It's much more densely packed, whereas the switchgrass is a little bit more delicate, has smaller spikelets. There's not as many of them. Tomorrow we'll look at more side-by-side photos of that when we talk about Johnson grass, but I did just want to mention it today. Okay, so looking up close, I tried to include a few different views of that triangle-shaped collection of white hairs. We can see one right here. You can kind of see it at the base down here and then over here. There are sometimes also hairs on the leaf blade itself, but hopefully you can see that's kind of distinctive with that dense collection right there. Okay, and then a few views of it in bloom. This one's super hard to photograph just because of how open and airy it is, but hopefully you can see some of that color. You get some of that reddish spikelets in here. This is a view of it in a garden setting, and it just has kind of it just looks beautiful. I love switchgrass. This one you can see some of the foliage can turn more of a yellow color too in the fall. You can get some red-ish color as well on some of the leaves when it's young and as it matures. So again, that color differentiation isn't super helpful like between this and a big blue stem. We'd maybe look at the flattened stem in a big blue versus round in a switchgrass. Okay, so there's, depending on what you're comparing, there's different characteristics that you can kind of pull out to look for. Okay, we're going to move on to Gama grass. Gama grass is another robust warm season bunch grass that I feel like is underappreciated in our prairie landscape, maybe because it's not as widespread across the state. Definitely more of a Southern Illinois grass. But it's fantastic and it has a really interesting growth form. It does like a little bit moister soil, so you can find it in areas with more moisture, but as well in prairies and savannas. This one forms huge bunches. It's really, again, hard to kind of see in the pictures here, but its natural growth form over time is to have the center die back really strongly. Not some of our bunch grasses, like in more of a landscape setting, the center will die back over time, but gamma grass definitely does it a lot more predictably. And so with that dieback in the center, all of the foliage around it gets pushed out. So it almost looks like a deer comes and like beds in the center of the grass and pushes all of those leaves and stems out. It's super distinctive if you see it in person. And it is one thing I look for because Gama grass is another lookalike to Johnson grass. And Gama grass we love, and Johnson grass we don't want to have around. So kind of that growth form is one distinctive way to tell them apart. It has large, like long, several feet long leaves that are very sharp. So a lot of our grasses have very sharp leaves that can cut you like a paper cut. If you've worked in prairies and you've walked through them, you know there's multiple reasons we wear long pants in the prairie, and getting cut by the grasses is one of them. And so if you were to run your finger backwards down the blade, I don't recommend it. Just be careful because it has cut me open many times. And it does have a prominent white midrib. We're also going to find that in Johnson grass, unfortunately. This is going to produce a very large raceme inflorescence, and it looks similar to big bluestem. So the first time I was doing field work in Southern Illinois, I saw this grass in bloom, and I thought I found like the coolest big bluestem specimen that had this huge raceme. And then I learned, no, it's a completely different plant. But it does have that turkey foot shape, right? That looks kind of like a big blue. This is going to have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. So up top, we have all of the male flowers that we can see have all those anthers right now. And at the base, we're going to have the female flowers with the stigma. And this is where our seeds are going to develop, which we'll see in a couple slides. Okay, so a couple views here. We do have some color differentiation, right? With more of this red on this leaf sheath and more of a yellow stem. I don't see that reliably enough that I would use those as markers. But here also you can just kind of see how broad this leaf is, compared to my hand. These leaf blades do tend to kind of wrap almost all the way around the stem when they form that sheath. You can see kind of how tightly they wrap around. And then we would say that it has a very, very, very short membranous ligule, almost non-existent. Okay, and then here's going to be a bunch of that that's just starting to bloom. Okay, a few other close-up pictures because I think it's just a cool looking plant. Again, we've got all of our male flowers up top, female at the bottom, and then it gets these really cool looking seeds that kind of are like Lego pieces that fit together and you can kind of break them off. Really, really cool structure. So, gamma grass. Okay, moving into prairie cordgrass, which is going to be found more in like a wet prairie or a marsh setting, but can be found in nearly every county in Illinois. This one is going to be a rhizomatous grass rather than a bunch grass. So this one, as we see in the picture, can form really big colonies and spread pretty rapidly. It's going to be similar height to like our switchgrass, 4 to 6 feet, and it's another one with extremely sharp leaves. Walking through this is really fun. Even with long pants on, sometimes you can still feel it. And what I like to say about the leaves on this grass is they're really long and they taper very slowly to a very sharp point. So we can see 2 to 3 foot long leaves. They're not that broad to start with, and they just gradually taper all the way to a really sharp point, and they tend to curve. They have that form too. This grass has a ligule that's hairy, a little fringe of hairs, and then it's going to have a raceme with finger-like collections of spikelets that are each a few inches long. So you can kind of see that here. So taking a closer look, here we're going to see that ligule with that fringe of white hairs. Something that we're not going to, I don't focus on, but other grass IDs will focus on is how tightly closed this sheath is versus open. So here we can see that the two sides of that blade where it's coming to form the sheath, it's wrapped extremely tight. So we'd call that a closed sheath. In other grasses, you'll see like a big V shape. It's very open. So if that's something that is helpful for you in prairie cordgrass, it's definitely very tightly closed. And you can see kind of that tuft of hairs. Again, here's another view of kind of that arching growth habit of all of those leaves. Okay, and then a couple views of it in bloom. This left one is full flower with all of those anthers hanging out in the wind to move around. And then you can see it's a collection of spikelets attached with a little pedicel or a little stalk. And then this is kind of more moving into the fall. We can see that color change where that whole inflorescence is going to get a little bit orangey gold, and it's done blooming at this point. Okay, we're going to move into porcupine grass in the Hesperostipa genus. This is one that you're going to find definitely central to northern Illinois. We don't have it where I am in far southern Illinois. Native grass of our prairies and savannas. This one is a cool season grass. So unlike all the ones we've talked about today, porcupine grass is going to grow earlier in the season and flower earlier in the season. That also means that as we get to about now, moving into next month, it's going to start to senesce and look dead. So whereas other grasses in the prairie are going to be green and alive and actively growing, some of the porcupine grass might look, you might be like, oh, this is last year's growth. It's just earlier in the year. So that can help tell them apart too. Typically under 4 feet tall. And if we look at some of the characteristics, we're going to see a tall membranous ligule. But if you catch it in bloom, it's going to be a lot easier to identify. So it is going to have a panicle inflorescence that nods to one side. And then it is going to have spikelets with crazy long awns. So we saw a picture of those earlier. They could be 5 to 7 inches long. And they are really interesting because they twist as they dry out, which in this grass has the purpose of also helping drive that seed down into the ground. Um, it also means if you seed collect porcupine grass, which I did as an intern, and you don't separate it out right away, your entire mass of seed twists into one giant ball. Um, I wasn't there long enough to see how they handled that. But just fun fact, the whole thing twisted together, a whole milk carton full. It was really interesting. So porcupine grass again, we can see that tall membranous ligule. And then this kind of view of it here in full bloom, you can see all of those long awns that are pretty visible. Now, as those seeds kind of spread and they go into the ground, you're going to be left with a structure that looks really different. So more like in this first picture, if I go back, we don't see as many of those awns remaining, and it'll kind of have this look to it. So just keep that in mind too. Looking up close, we can see we kind of have some little branches with our awns, excuse me, our spikelets with our awns attached to them. Another view here, and then again, that same picture that we had, you can see how it's already twisted and started to dry out. So super cool. The tips of these spikelets are really sharp. Also, if you work with other people and interns, they're fun to throw at one another. They get stuck in your clothes. Okay, moving on from porcupine grass, we're going to look into a couple different species in the Bouteloua genus. So the first one we're going to look at is side oats grama. Has kind of an interesting distribution across the state. You can find it all the way from northern to southern Illinois, but it does skip a good portion of central Illinois. Okay, this is another one that we're going to find in more of our upland prairies, more of our glades and bluffs. It is a warm season bunch grass, but a lot shorter. So 2 to 3 feet tall. This is going to be more on the scale of like a little blue stem, in kind of the height and the delicate stems. One of the most reliable characteristics I look for before it's blooming, because it's pretty distinctive when it is in bloom, is to look for hairs along the edges of the leaves. And there are um, individual hairs that are each attached on top of a tiny little gland. So we'll look at some pictures of that, but that's a super distinctive characteristic for this grass. Hairs on glands on the leaf edges. It does have a raceme inflorescence that kind of zigzags. We can see that here. You see kind of that zigzag shape. And then as the season progresses, a lot of the times that rachis or the whole stem of the grass will even bow to one side and all the little spikelets or oats hang off the side. So that's kind of where it gets that name from. The individual spikelets can be reddish in color, but also green in color, and then they have small awns as well. This photo down here is going to be late fall going into winter when it's turned more of that straw color. Again, you're going to, as time goes on, you're going to lose a lot of the spikelets off of your rachis. You can kind of see all the zigzag that's empty right here. So you might find it really late in the season and you might only find like one spikelet on it, or you might just see the zigzag shape in a small bunch grass. And then that might give you a clue that you're looking at side oats. Okay, so here is my attempt to get these pictures of these hairs, but hopefully you can see they're right along the edge. Now there are some on the leaf blades too, but right along the edge, and hopefully you can see kind of this little circle that's a little gland, okay? Sometimes really, really small and almost impossible to see, but pointing out a few of them here, that you have these hairs on the edges attached on little glands. Okay, this is really early in the season, new growth. Okay, and then a few different pictures of this grass in bloom. Again, we're going to have this little collection of spikelets attached in a little stalk, so we call this a raceme. We have little awns. This one's really showing that red color, whereas over here we have more of a green to reddish. This is it in bloom. Was really lucky to find it. It has bright red anthers when it's in bloom, and then these little white fluffy stigma. And then again, this is it after it's completed flowering, it's gone to seed, and it's not actively growing anymore, turns kind of that more straw color. Okay, so side oats grama is one Bouteloua, which is just the most fun genus name to say. The second one we're going to look at is blue grama, super restricted in Illinois. Only a few counties, very specific in wanting sandy, less, or gravel prairies. So not as common. If you do find it, super cool. There is another grama grass called hairy grama that looks similar to this one, that you can also find, but is again um, pretty restricted, I believe, in its distribution. I haven't looked that up recently though, so I could be a little off on that one. Native grass, and this one's really, really short, really small, really delicate, very easy to overlook. So typically under a foot tall, even when it is in bloom. It is a warm season bunch grass. Again, it does have a hairy ligule, um, but it's a very, very small grass, so it's going to be hard to see. Um, Easiest to tell when it's in blooming. Before it's blooming, I don't know that I'd be able to reliably identify this grass. But we're going to find a raceme inflorescence with bluish to red spikelets kind of arranged together to resemble like an eyelash, or a collection, like the collection of eyelashes on your eye, I guess, to be more technical. Okay, a few other pictures up close. This is with it flowering. And then this is it in a garden setting. So it is starting to catch on a little bit in the native gardening realm. So you might see it planted sometimes, but still is relatively difficult to find. Okay, and then a few other pictures of it growing out among other grasses. Again, we can see how thin those stems are. I just took a picture here so you can see very, very small, delicate grass. Not a lot of leaves along the stem, and I wasn't able to get a good picture of that ligule because it's so, so small. So I don't have that to show you, but small, hairy, short, hairy ligule on blue grama. Okay, if you find what you think is blue grama to tell it apart from hairy grama. Hairy grama is going to be hairier, more hairs on the raceme, on the pedicels, and its anthers are usually red, whereas here we could see they're this more yellowy color in the blue grama. Just a couple ways to tell those apart. Okay, our next grass is Purpletop. Tridens flavus. This is one that again is a lot of times considered a weedier grass just on where we find it growing, but I think it's a great native grass. We find it in more like savannas, woodland borders. I find it along roadsides a lot of the time. It's another warm season grass, grows about 4 feet tall. You may know it as greasegrass, which is another name. I prefer purple top. I feel like that gives it a little bit better PR. But it does have very greasy stems. So if we were in person before I told you about that, I'd say, hey, come here, run your hand along this stem. And you'd be like, that's disgusting. It feels really greasy all over my hand, but very easy, reliable way to identify it. It's also going to have some velvety hairs and kind of some interesting spots on the grass. We're going to find them on the nodes, and we're going to find them kind of underneath the leaf blades in the collar region, which is kind of a weird spot for hairs. It does produce these panicle inflorescences with kind of drooping branches, so we can see the kind of graceful arch of all of those branches. This is what it looks like when it's first starting to bloom. So at first it'll look like everything's being held to one side and then it'll pop open all the way. And the spikelets are also very greasy. And of course, with that name, they are purple in color too. Okay, so looking at this grass up close, we can see we've got a bunch of hairs. This is what I was saying here, is that you're gonna have hairs underneath the leaf blade right here. I think I said there were hairs on the nodes too, but I'm not seeing it in this picture, so I'll have to double check that one. I don't know if I put this here because that was an exception to the rule or if I misspoke on the previous slide. I can't remember off the top of my head. So jury's out on the nodes on the hairy nodes, but definitely these velvety hairs underneath the leaf blade right here. Kind of a translucent midrib on the leaf too, not really prominent there. Okay, and then again, a few views of it in bloom. On the left, this is it just starting to bloom. Sometimes it is pretty green in color, and it doesn't fully get that purple color until it's got this full form. And then just another up close view of that purple color on that grass. That's going to be Purpletop or greasegrass. Again, if we're looking at kind of the greasiness of the grass, probably there as like an anti-herbivory type of function. Okay, we're going to look at Canada wild rye now, Elymus canadensis. If you joined us yesterday, we looked at three other rye grasses. We looked at bottlebrush grass, Virginia wild rye, and silky wild rye. So now we're going to look at our fourth one, Canada wild rye, which you can also find on like woodland edges, but this one I typically find more in full sun areas. So in prairies, in savannas, in even in some lower quality, more disturbed habitats. I've seen Canada wild rye, found throughout the state, every county in Illinois. And this is a cool season grass, just like the porcupine grass that we looked at earlier. So the photo in the bottom left, this is kind of late summer, early fall. It's already going to be turned brown. Typically, it will stay under 5 feet tall. And just like the other rise that we looked at yesterday, the leaves are going to be kind of, we describe it as a weak leaf. These are thin. They are shiny, but they're look at in a second, as and then a lot of the ways that the shape of the spike and the form of the awns. So in the case of wild rye, you're going to have a spike in fluorescence and it's going to droop. So as it's emerging, it might be held straight up, but if you give it some time, you can see it strongly droops in both of these pictures. And then as it matures, the awns are going to curve. So in this one, right, we're starting to see some of those awns curve, but it hasn't quite reached that point where it's a reliable identification characteristic, as we see in this photo on the left, where you have that drooping spike and all of these curved out awns. Okay. So looking at this up close, we can see our membranous ligule. There is a very short little remain of an auricle here, but they've already faded away on both of these grasses. So again, that's kind of an early season characteristic for a lot of grasses. Here I'm showing you, this is the upper side of the leaf and then the underside of the leaf. So the underside is going to have more of that shine. And with this grass, like with a lot of the other wild rye's, the leaves can tend to twist and show their shiny undersides on the top. Okay, so here we see this is the upper side of the leaf blade and it's twisting right here. This one is twisting much closer to the base of the leaf and showing that shiny underside up top. Okay, a few close-up views of the spike. This one, again, when it starts, you've got all of these kind of dense spikelets together. You've got all of those awns. And we kind of need to wait a little bit later in the season if that's what we're using to tell it apart from other ryes, to wait and see all of those curved awns. But that one is Canada wild rye. Despite the name Canada wild rye, it is native to the US, native to North America. Okay, we're gonna move into prairie dropseed. You might know this one from more of the gardening or the landscape world. It's one of the most popular native plants that's being planted. I have maybe only seen it out while I'm hiking, I think at one spot. So this isn't one that I've typically come across, but I'm also in Southern Illinois and you can see its distribution much more in central and northern parts of the state. It's going to be a native warm season bunch grass that we can find in our prairies and more of like limestone glades, typically under 3 feet tall. This grass is going to really have that bunch, that strong bunch form with really dense collections of narrow tapering leaves. So you're going to have really tight bunches, at least over a foot to 2 feet long leaves that kind of curve out. If we look up close, our leaves are going to have some short hairs in the collar region. It does have a fringed membranous ligule that's very, very short and kind of really hard to see on this grass because it is smaller. And then when it blooms, it's going to have more of a narrow panicle inflorescence. And the spikelets, when they're mature, do have a really strong odor. And the crowd is out. It seems to be kind of split. If it smells like buttered popcorn or if it smells like cilantro when it's mature. So if you want to put in the chat what it smells like to you, to me, it smells like buttered popcorn, almost like a sickly sweet smell. But some folks definitely say cilantro, so it's kind of an interesting side of the spectrum. But again, another clue or hint um, that that's what you're looking at. One time I was visiting the Missouri Botanic Garden and they have a bunch of native grasses that they've put in. And I was walking along and the smell of butter popcorn was so strong. I was like, where's the prairie dropseed? I know it's here. And in fact, there was huge plantings of it. And I just happened to be there at the right time that that smell was like overpowering. It was really fun. All right, so let's look at some pictures. Again, kind of these vegetative characteristics I typically don't use because oftentimes just the general growth form of it is kind of enough to identify it. But you can look for those hairs in the collar region at the top of the leaf sheath. Again, really, really short fringed ligule that's nearly impossible to see here, and I couldn't focus in any clearer with my camera. And this is going to be a picture of it in the fall. So kind of getting that senesced look where it's no longer actively growing. You see all of those leaves. These are all of the panicles with their seeds on them. And then a couple other views of it as it's developing and starting to flower. Here we can kind of see it can vary in color. It can be a little bit reddish. It can stay more green. Just kind of depends. But you'll see that once it's kind of popped open, it is a panicle, but it's kind of a more narrow panicle. Now there are other drop seeds in Illinois. I want to say there's about nine. Let me check my notes. I think there's about nine species in this genus. And about six of the other ones have more of like a spike-like panicle. So where it stays super, super contracted and doesn't really puff out. So that is kind of one way to differentiate between some of the drop seeds. Kind of the most other common one that folks come across is sand drop seed. That's going to be like up in northern Illinois. So that might be a look-alike if you're up in that area to pay attention to. Okay, next is going to be Junegrass. Junegrass is another shorter bunch grass, and it's another cool season grass. So again, this one kind of has a scattered distribution, but can be found from north to southern Illinois. It's gonna like more like limestone glades, sandier soil, so a little bit more restricted in where it grows. And it's going to stay relatively short with those bunches. And then when it gets that flowering stalk, it's still going to be under 2 feet tall. The sheaths on this one are going to have some soft, short hairs. It's also going to have a short membranous ligule. And then it's going to have, again, a narrow panicle inflorescence that does resemble more of a spike. So we can see here, you might immediately say, hey, that looks like a spike. But if we were able to look, you'd see these short little branches in here holding those spikelets out. I did order some June grass this year, put it into a pollinator garden that I have at work. So this is what some of the bunches look like that were planted early in the year. So they're still retaining that green color right now, but kind of have those short leaf blades in this bunch. Whereas like a prairie drop seed, its leaf blades are going to be long enough that they're going to curve and kind of taper towards the ground, whereas the June grass is going to stay shorter. Okay, looking up close, we can kind of see that hair, those hairs on the leaf sheath, right? Kind of dense woolly hairs. We can see a little bit of that ligule in here. And then again, this is it when it is flowering. It's got kind of this more silvery, light green color. And then once it's done flowering, everything, all those branches kind of tighten up and it does really look like a spike, right? If I saw it at this point, I wouldn't think that it was once a panicle. So everything kind of contracts back. It turns more of that golden color. Just based on everything else in the background, this is like in the summer, right? It already is done blooming, and this is kind of the form it takes for the rest of the year. Okay, our next grass that we're going to look at is purple love grass, um, found in every county in Illinois. The love grasses as a group, there's about 15 different species of them, so we're not going to be able to kind of break them down. But the color reliably for this one is one of the main ways that we tell it apart. So this is going to be Found in our prairies, but it also can do well in like disturbed areas too. So I have seen it kind of on the edges of paths and more restoration settings that maybe the restoration isn't doing super great. So it's not as restrictive to a higher quality habitat. It is a warm season bunch grass and it is relatively short, and most of the height comes from its panicle. This is another one that's super, super, super difficult to photograph, but it gets these huge panicles that are at least a foot, if not a foot and a half in size, and the whole plant itself is typically under 2 feet tall. So there really is just like a small collection of leaves at the base, and the bulk of it is that kind of puff of the panicle. This one is super hairy. We're going to have a lot of hairs on this grass, a hairy ligule. We're going to have densely hairy leaf blades, leaf sheaths. Within our inflorescence, within that panicle, we're going to have a hairy stem or rachis. We're going to have hairy branches. And then we're going to have these really, really small purple spikelets that are held on all of those branches. Okay, so zooming in again, it's a pretty hairy grass. I think they could have named it hairy purple lovegrass. I think that would have been appropriate. But again, hairy ligule, you can see that tuft, hairy leaf blades, hairy leaf sheaths. And then again, this is kind of a close-up of that panicle. You can see all the hairs all the way down and then over on the branches too. Okay, here's kind of one of the panicles that's starting to pop out. A lot of the times you'll have kind of like two different leaves across from one another, and then you get that big spray of the panicle that comes out. You see that in like a witchgrass also, and a few other panicums or love grasses. And we can kind of see that again, kind of from the opposite side in this picture all the way on the right. And then again, a close-up of how tiny those little spikelets are, and that purplish red color. Okay, if my notes are correct, we've got two more grasses left. So deer tongue grass is another dicanthelium. We talked about these yesterday in the woodland section. There's about 33, 34 species of dicantheliums in Illinois. They're very difficult to tell apart, but the two we talked about yesterday and this one today are kind of the most easily identifiable ones. So deer tongue grass is native. A lot of people consider it kind of a weedier grass because it does grow in disturbed areas on woodland edges, edges of restorations. In that way, I think it's a really fun grass. It's another cool season. And it's typically will kind of grow a couple feet tall and it'll flower in the spring. And then this one continues to grow and almost gets up to 4 feet. And then it will flower a second time in the season with smaller self-fertile flowers that kind of come off as like side shoots after that main top panicle has occurred. So that's kind of something we see in the dicantheliums, and I see that regularly in the deer tongue grass. This one has variation on the leaves. They can be hairy or smooth, but typically we do see leaf sheaths that have really stiff hairs on them, and we'll see that in a second. The leaves are also short, broad, and you can see they clasp the stem. Okay, so that whole leaf lace is going to wrap around the stem of the grass. Like I said, we're going to have panicle inflorescences. The spikelets are going to be round like the rest of our dicantheliums, and it has that double bloom window. Okay, so here we can see those really stiff hairs, right? They're really bristly, rather than like some that are more soft, like in the purple lovegrass we looked at. Those are going to be really soft hairs. These are really bristly, stiff hairs. This one doesn't have hairs on the leaves, but like I said, you can find that. And then here you have more of clasping leaf bases too. Okay, here's a few different views of it in bloom. Again, we're going to have a panicle with those really round spikelets. They are also hairy. It's hard to tell in the pictures, but they have softer hairs along the spikelets. These in particular are kind of reddish in color. They can vary on that realm. Okay, and then our last one is blue joint grass, and this is more of a wetland grass, but we're not doing a whole wetland grass section, so I kind of pushed it into the prairie section, so we made sure to cover it. This one is going to be found more in central and northern Illinois, and definitely found in more wetland habitats like your marshes or your swamps, but you can also find it in wetter prairies. It is another cool season grass that is rhizomatous, so it's going to form big patches or big colonies like in the photo bottom left. The foliage of this one can have more of a blue-gray hue to it, although not always. It typically stays under 4 feet tall, and if we look, it is going to have a tall membranous ligule. And then the panicle is going to be kind of interesting. And there's a few of them like this, where it is a panicle inflorescence where everything is puffed out, lots of branches, but then as it senesces, everything kind of hangs to one side. So we see that pictured down below here, where we have kind of this orangey brown color, and all of the branches are kind of hanging off to one side. And then the spikelets, if we look real close, are going to have these little white tufts of hair. So let's look up close. Blue joint grass, tall membranous ligule, right? No hairs anywhere on the leaves, on the leaf sheaths on the stem, really smooth, kind of nondescript looking grass. Um, and I put this picture in here because this is when that panicle is puffed out. And this is what it looks like once it's senesced. So kind of two different looks, right, for this grass. But you can kind of see how it starts out here, can get kind of that reddish color, and then it will senesce and kind of curve to one side, get that orangey gold color. If we look really close, again, really, really hard to photograph, but I'll try to point it out. And this is where like 10-time magnification little hand lens can come in handy. There's little white tufts of hairs that are kind of tucked into these spikelets. I really only see one, two, maybe three in this photo, but they are kind of tucked in there, and that's another thing you can look for with this grass. Okay, folks. We've made it to our review. We've made it through all 17 of our grasses, and most of you are still with me. So give yourselves a pat on the back. We're going to go through and do a review just like we did yesterday. If you have the handout, you have all the answers, so there's no excuses for not putting them in the chat, right? But this one should be pretty easy. If you want to tell me which grass we looked at today that has horns. Awesome. You're all getting it into the chat. This is great. Remember, that's Indian grass. We're going to find that characteristic there. Excellent. You know, I'm not expecting us to remember every grass that we cover today, but there are a few that hopefully are easier than others. Our next review is a grass that has a flattened stem. Again, there were a few different ones that had that flattened stem characteristic. Which ones do you remember? Put them in the chat. Awesome. Great. Yes, we looked at three: big blue stem, little blue stem, and broomsedge are all going to have that more flattened stem rather than round. Okay, give an example of a grass that is purple. There's kind of some obvious ones. You could also get tricky if we talk foliage. There's a few that maybe had some purple hints to them, if you want to put those in there. But there's a few words in the name, so it should be pretty easy. All right, excellent. So I'm seeing a lot of purpletop, purple lovegrass. I was waiting for someone to put in there like the tips of big bluestem leaves could perhaps be purple or blue. So that is a possibility. But yeah, we'll keep it simple. Purple top, purple lovegrass are our purple grasses. Example of a grass that has a membranous ligule. There were quite a few. If you just want to pop one in the chat that you remember that had a membranous ligule. All right. We have lots of great answers in here. I'll pop some up here and show you some examples. Big blue, little blue, broomsedge, the Indian grass again. This picture I didn't share earlier, but this kind of shows the horns plus the membranous ligule. So you can kind of get a different view of what that looks like there. Porcupine grass, Junegrass. So lots of different options with those membranous ligules. And then how about a grass with awns? Awns on the spikelets. Let's see, and lots of great examples in there. Lots of people are saying porcupine grass. Yes, that one's easy for sure. So just a few Indian grass, side oats, grama, porcupine, Canada wild rye. There are others I see in here. Yes, the big blue had awns too. Just picked a few and put those up. Okay, and then I think this is my last one. If I remember, what was that grass that had the hairs on the edges of the leaves? Fantastic. See, everyone's going to be a grass ID expert after today. I love it. Side oats, grama grass. Correct. Had those hairs on the leaf edges. Side oats grandma. All right, I'm going to run through our resources and then we'll get to our questions. So this is the same if you were here yesterday, but just kind of running through them again. General grass ID field guides that I recommend, Grasses, Sedges, and Rushes by Lauren Brown and Ted Elliman. You may be familiar with Lauren Brown's original 1979, I think, book. And then during COVID times, her and Ted came out with a new version, updated with color pictures included, especially for today's grasses. If you want to get into more of the nuance of like seedling grass identification, the Tall Grass Prairie Center Guide has great pictures and descriptions to tell apart seedlings, not only of grasses, but of other prairie plants. And then I always recommend the Illinois Wildflower website. And as we discussed yesterday, as an app, iNaturalist has gotten way better with grasses. So I definitely recommend using that as well if you want an app. Check. One of the things I've been doing over the past, I don't know, 8 years is working to create more grass ID resources because there is such a deficit of them. So all of my resources can be accessed at go.illinois.edu/grasses. That includes a website, a blog, short videos, and recorded webinars like today's. And then if you are sticking with us for tomorrow, we'll be looking at nuisance grasses. We'll talk about what a nuisance grass is. This is going to include native, non-native, and invasive species. We'll look at identifying those, telling them apart from others at the same time, 1 to 3 p.m. And we'll begin with that same short grass ID review that we did today with a few different quiz questions. So I'll end here and turn it over to Abigail to see what we've got in the chat. We have quite a lot of time for questions, so we can get through. We have a lot.
Yeah. Do you want to go more general or do you want kind of like specific ones first? Because some people have some specific questions about specific grasses as you were talking about them. Others,
Let's go more general to
okay.
start.
Yeah, so the a question that people had throughout the chat, you mentioned just a little bit about the distribution maps, but
Mhm.
how accurate do you consider them be? Where are you sourcing them from?
Yeah.
Um, are they like the actual distributions kind of thing?
That is a great question. So all of the maps, I've got it on this slide, but I didn't say it earlier, are from USDA plants from their database. So my understanding, I haven't looked it up recently, but my understanding is a lot of it is based on kind of historical distribution, and I don't know the timeline on that. But this and kind of Bonaps distribution maps are kind of the two main ones that are kind of used at this point in time as distribution. So, of course, there could be changes. There could be different things. I'm kind of interested to see, like, comparing with iNaturalist now that we have a lot of observations that are like being taken as folks are out in the field, how that might change. I will say when we get into tomorrow with a lot of the nuisance grasses, I do pull maps from EnMaps, which is kind of tracking of invasive species. And so that is a little bit more, has like recently aggregated data. And I did do some comparisons of those maps versus like the ones pulled from USDA plants for just to see. And there were more counties reported in EnMaps. So it is definitely possible that it's not completely accurate, but it is kind of one of the standing resources that we use a lot of the time. And then like Bonap does pull from USDA plants too. So that's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to think in maps. Like, what were the two maps you mentioned?
So USDA plants database, I have them up, so I'll drop the links in. And then Bonap is Biota of North America program, and they have a map um, a mapping part of that project. So I dropped both of those in there. You can use those. And then EdMaps is the other one. And this one does aggregate from, it pulls in like iNaturalist data too, for more of the like plants that are currently moving that we want to pay attention to where they move next, right? Because they are potentially problematic.
Yeah. Okay. Um, are there any indicators that can help you identify like the inflorescence type before it pops open?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, Not reliably. So for some of them, right, it might be like if you start to see an inflorescence, but you don't know if it's like fully emerged, fully open, you can kind of like it's hard to describe it without doing it in person, but kind of like pull the different pieces together, kind of see if some branches pop out. I'll have a picture of me doing that tomorrow where I kind of show that, oh, this looks like a spike, but you can pull it back and see there are branches. But otherwise, a lot of times with grass ID, sometimes it's just wait and see. Sometimes you just can't tell from a vegetative characteristic. You need to wait for it to flower to really be sure. So sometimes it is just a little bit of a waiting game.
Awesome. There was another question. There's a couple of people asked a question like this, but what is your thoughts and opinions on native grass cultivars that are available pros and cons of using them in the home garden. And then Margaret had commented just now saying, like they're being planted in, are the ones being planted in the drop seeds being planted cultivars or are they true natives? So I guess that's kind of two questions, but related to this like nativar idea.
Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting, a lot of when we talk grasses in particular, right? Most of them, right, they're not being visited by pollinators for pollen or nectar, right? They're wind pollinated. So a lot of their use is habitat for our wildlife, for our insects. There are some caterpillars, there's skipper caterpillars that will eat the leaves of some of our native grasses. There are other leaf-eating insects that will visit. And then your birds, right, are going to come and eat the seeds and other wildlife in that. So if we're talking like home landscape wise, compared to like your flowering plants, it's not going to be as big of a potential change, right, to choose a cultivar. But most of the grasses, the cultivars are chosen for a different leaf color. And if you change leaf color, then you have the potential to deter feeding insects. So if your goal is to support, your native wildlife, I always recommend going with the straight native species. Now, that means some of these plants you don't want in your home garden. You're not going to want big bluestem, right? You're not going to want Indian grass because they don't behave. But like a little bluestem, absolutely love it. And then depending on where you source your plants, right? Like my little bluestem that I got is a bluer strain. So sometimes you have like that's the natural variety, right, that you have in that location. And then that's what I have in my garden. So I don't know prairie drop seed wise. That's not one that I've heard that there are like cultivars are. Abigail, I don't know if you know. If you've heard of prairie drop seed cultivars and that one in particular, like I know there are little blue stem cultivars and others, but I don't know if drop seed has a bunch.
I'm not familiar. I'm just doing like a quick
Mhm.
Google and like it looks like there's like one maybe, but
Okay.
it's not enough that I feel comfortable
Mhm.
talking about. So I don't think it's a like very bunchy grass, I feel like. So it's not really like people tend not to change that one because it still
Yeah.
behaves, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're wondering what's being planted. I mean, if I don't know.
Yeah.
But with prairie drop seed, I love my wild type prairie drop seed. It's gorgeous. It does amazing in my garden.
Awesome. Well, when it comes to like learning identification and things like that, what are your top tips for memorizing grasses? Do you have like a specific type of organization, structure? You're just steel trap of a mind?
I mean, I don't have, you may have seen me referencing some notes. I don't have every single characteristic of every grass memorized in my brain, right? Um, some of them, a lot of it is just practice, right? Like when I learned a lot of these grasses, I was out in the field every day. Um, and I had to identify a lot of them before they were in flower. And sometimes that meant that we thought it was one thing and then it bloomed and we went, oops, it's actually this other grass. And so a lot of it is just practice repetition. If you're able to go out locally with like other groups that are leading plant ID hikes, or get involved with like a restoration group or a group like Master Naturalists, just like kind of being in that environment can help. But no, a lot of it, there aren't a lot of great resources. So that's what I've been trying to build over time, is just like short videos or other easily digestible things. But otherwise, it's it's tricky, and a lot of it is just being out and seeing things. We're lucky now we have the apps that are way more reliable that we didn't have, that I didn't use when I was first learning. So.
On the like notion of the photos you take as well, do you have
Mhm.
any tips for getting good photos of grasses for ID purposes?
I wish you could see how many bad grass photos I have. So there's a lot of good ones. And again, it's just being out in the field. I do have like a low level Nikon camera. It's not fancy at all. That helps. But probably half the pictures that I showed today were just taken on an iPhone. And you see my hand in a lot of them. So unfortunately, like to get them to focus, that's kind of what you need. Sometimes you can trick your camera, you can focus it with your hand behind the grass and remove it and it stays focused. But a lot of the times, it is really difficult to get like a clear grass photo. The prairie ones are easier because there's like you don't have shading effects as much, like the woodland grasses are harder to get. And then being out on like an overcast day, you're gonna get some better photos than with that bright, harsh sun. Um, but otherwise, again, it's just being out and practicing.
Okay, so back to some like grass anatomy. Do
Okay.
panicles typically have multiple spikelets per point where the pedicel attaches to the rachis?
Oh, it varies. It varies. There can be individual ones or there can be a bunch. So unfortunately, there's no like hard and fast rule on that.
Okay. The Tallgrass Prairie Center Guide, is that available for download online or is it just through Amazon?
That one is a book format. So no, it is not available for free for download. At least that I know of. I haven't tried. Someone gifted it to me, so but I don't think so with that one.
All right, just a few other like more species specific questions-ish. You
Okay.
can see me, I realize. But are all of the love grasses native?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that one off the top of my head, but I can consult my field guide real fast if you want to give me another question while I look that up.
Yeah. How does one distinguish between reed canary grass and Canada rye very early in the year?
Ooh, reed canary and Canada wild rye. So you're gonna look for the oracles, right? But like, I don't know, Canada wild rye, I don't feel like they're super reliable with the oracles. Some of the other ryes, they're really distinctive. Um, I'm gonna say they're gonna be difference in like the width of the leaf blades. I'd have to look at that. Um, If you're going to be on tomorrow, I'll look it up and I'll mention it when we talk about reed canary grass tomorrow. So that's a good one. I haven't thought about those lookalikes. I typically don't find them, I guess, necessarily quite in the same areas. Reed canary is going to be in a little bit more of a wetter area, um, which I guess Canada wild rye can be there too. But yeah, I'll look into it. We'll see.
Okay, so keeping it going. Is the purple top inflorescence greasy at all stages?
Typically, yes, right? If you get to midwinter, probably not. But like and in the actively growing season, yeah, it's gonna be greasy.
And
Um, to get
oh,
to get
keep
back to
going.
your lovegrass question,
Yes.
no, there are a bunch of non-native lovegrasses also in Illinois.
There you go. Not all love grasses are the same.
Most of them seem to be non-native actually. So
Oh. When does purple top typically bloom?
Purpletop is a warm season, so it's going to be, at least in southern Illinois, it's going to be right about now. So maybe a little bit later if you're further north, but late summer into fall.
Nice. In blue grama grass, you mentioned
Mhm.
like the glands. What would be like the reason, like what would be the benefit of those glands for that grass? Like what are those for?
Oh, in like the side oats grama, the glands with the hairs, I don't actually know. That's a really good question. And I have no idea, so I'm not even going to try to speculate.
All right.
Some of these things, sometimes you're like, I feel like it's just there because it's a good identification characteristic. Like, what's the purpose of a horn? I don't know, but it's great for me. So, yeah, good question. I'm not sure.
So when it came to Indian grass, there was also some questions around like other common names around Indian grass.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's a conversation that we've had around like nomenclature. Is there like there was like yellow prairie grass? I just didn't know if you had other thoughts or other things you've heard. Feather grass.
Yeah. Yeah, yellow prairie grass is one that is been proposed and is gaining more popularity with that one too. I haven't adopted that one yet just because it's more on the up and coming. So I did mean to mention it. So thank you folks for calling that one out. That is one of our new common names too. Mhm.
Yeah. Do, 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 do. And then somebody had asked also about like, will you be hosting any classes that focus more on management side of restoring prairie ecosystems, or do you have any other resources where something like that, people could find something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I typically don't do a lot of, I haven't done a lot of online ones. I've done some in person. And we do have a newer extension specialist whose focus is on grassland ecosystems, in Illinois Extension. So we're hoping to get a little bit more resources created for that because we are a little lacking in that, in Illinois Extension. So hopefully in upcoming, we'll have a little bit more to share on that front.
I do know that that's Dr. John Henn. He gave a talk on fire ecology, that yeah, we can look at sending. So okay, I don't think I had any more questions, but there was someone who had their hand raised, but I don't see it anymore. Paul, I feel like.
I don't know. I think we might have it where folks are not able to unmute.
I don't know. There was a few who unmuted themselves on accident, so um might have been an
Okay,
accident too. So,
that's okay.
well, Erin's here as well, so here's her email. So definitely feel free to email her. She is the grasses lady and very good at it. And if she doesn't know the answer, she knows someone to ask. So, all right,
That
Erin.
is true. Yeah. I don't know all the answers, but I can definitely help
Oh, we
direct the right person.
yeah, we had one more person come through just asking a quick compare switchgrass and Johnson grass ID.
Yeah, so that's going to be tricky. With the Johnson grass is going to tend to, it's a rhizomatous grass, but sometimes it can look like a bunch grass, like the switchgrass. You we'll look at some great pictures tomorrow, so I hope you can join. Johnson grass leaves tend to just look super sickly, even early in the season. They have all of this like red, like it looks like diseased leaves just don't look healthy. Like all this spotting along them. So I usually look for that as compared to like a green leaf on a switchgrass. The Johnson grass tends to be a little bit taller. And then like switchgrass, yeah, it's gonna have more of that tight bunch. And then like an open airy panicle with like tiny spikelets, whereas Johnson grasses are a lot bigger. And so it's hard to describe it without pictures, but yes, we will look at that again tomorrow. But those are a couple of the different things. As the leaves die too, we talked about the switchgrass that curl really tightly. Johnson grass isn't going to do that. Johnson grass is going to have a really hairy, velvety ligule. Switchgrass is going to have that triangle-shaped collection of hairs, so sometimes those might be confusing. Those are just a few things.
Awesome. All righty.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you joining us today for day two.